Hi, welcome to another episode. This one is called Debunking Myths, and essentially that's what we're going to do. We're going to think about some of the messages and beliefs in society and question the truth behind them. Because ultimately, sexual violence still remains a highly stigmatised topic, and it's one that carries an abundance of prejudice and misinformation that not only harms the individuals who've experienced sexual violence, but it actually creates a society that perpetuates the problem. And it means that we don't focus our attention on the things that we should be. It takes our attention away from what individuals really need, and it doesn't allow us to uncover the truth behind these experiences and the truth behind the impact that these experiences have. So hopefully in this video, we can start to recognise these for what they are, myths, and hopefully reduce the power that they have over what is considered to be the truth. And I just want to mention as well that we recognise sexual violence is not a gendered thing. It can happen to any individual of any gender. And across the genders, these experiences hold their own sets of stigma and prejudice. And we will be talking about that as we move forward in further videos. But for now, this episode is about the myths pertaining to women who've experienced sexual violence. And that's not to say that it's only men that hold these views. That's not true. In actual fact, women tend to hold these views more strongly. And actually, there's a lot of research around this, and it's kind of uncovered this idea that women tend to hold beliefs that women are in some way to blame for what's happened to them. And in a sense, it sort of acts as a protective mechanism, as a way of separating themselves from a person who's become a victim of sexual violence. I guess, really, if we can blame the woman and say, well, she was wearing a short skirt or she shouldn't have been walking home alone, then it allows them to create this sort of barrier between them and her. And she can tell herself that, well, I just won't walk home alone. And it reduces the vulnerability that she may feel in the world. Because ultimately, we know really that nothing anybody does ever influences being assaulted. But to accept that fact means having to accept that we live in a society where this happens at alarming rates, and that can be really scary. So although the intention is not to perpetuate these harmful myths, we do sometimes become part of that cycle, and it can be really damaging to individuals, which is why there's a lot of research in this area, and it's possibly one of the most kind of researched topics in terms of sexual violence. And it was first paid attention to way back in 1975. And there was a study that essentially tried to understand what these beliefs and attitudes were. And they were coined rape myths. And essentially, these rape myths are sets of beliefs and attitudes towards sexual violence. And that includes beliefs about the person that it's happened to. So beliefs around their personality, their behaviour, even, ethnicity and demographic factors. They categorise beliefs around the perpetrator as well. So thinking about his personality and his motivations for committing such offences. And they also include contextual factors, so kind of placing conditions on what constitutes as sexual violence, where it takes place, and when it takes place. But more modern research has simplified it in some way, and they've categorised rape myths into 4 different categories. And they include: she asked for it, he didn't mean to, it wasn't really rape, and she lied. And within all of those 4 categories, there are different thoughts that go with it, there are different beliefs, different statements that you'll hear. But essentially they serve to somehow downplay or justify sexual violence in some way. And they can be really detrimental to not just the individual, but also these beliefs filter into society and the services and the support that are available to individuals as well, and the likelihood for individuals to seek out that support. So it's really important that we're able to recognise when we are being met with a rape myth, when we are hearing these things. It's really important that we can recognise them for the myths that they are and not the truth. So we're going to go into them in a little bit more detail. So if we start with she asked for it. I've certainly heard a lot of sentences and statements that basically represent this rape myth, and unfortunately I'm sure you have as well. You know, things like, why didn't she say no? Was she drinking? She shouldn't have got herself into that state. You know, well, she led him on. She was dressed provocatively. You know, even things like, well, she shouldn't have been walking home alone. These myths are far too common. And a study actually highlighted just how common these are. In a study of nearly 1,000 undergraduate students, 53% of people agreed that the women's actions somehow prompted her to be raped. And that is a shockingly large statistic. And even though there is no truth in that whatsoever, it's really understandable that if you have been met with that response, or even just the acknowledgement that those statistics exist, it's understandable to have an emotional response to that. And you're allowed to be angry and you're allowed to be hurt. And like we've mentioned in other videos, although becoming aware of these beliefs and aware of these scripts, it can be really powerful. It can take a while. It can take a long time for you to stop taking them in. But if you are to take one thing from this video, let it be this. Let it be the fact that nothing, not a single thing anybody does, nothing that anybody wears, nowhere where anybody is, should they be subject to sexual violence. And the responsibility lies simply with the person who has done this to you. So the second myth is he didn't mean to. And again, although we know that the responsibility is solely on that person, this myth comprises of beliefs that somehow try to excuse, minimize, or even deny the person's behaviour. You may hear questions such as, are you sure? He's a really nice guy. Or, are you sure he didn't misunderstand? You know, did you say no? Was it a miscommunication? Was he drunk? Essentially questioning the truth behind what happened. And with a lot of these myths, people don't endorse them because they want to hurt people. They endorse them because it's convenient. And I think that's particularly relevant with this myth because people don't want to acknowledge that people close to them could be capable of committing such offences. So it's easier to deny it and to lie to themselves than it is to accept the truth. But that's exactly what it is. It's about them and their beliefs. They do not represent anything to do with what actually happened. And it's going to be difficult to hear those messages. And regardless of the reason why anybody is perpetuating these myths, they shouldn't be. And you're allowed to be angry, and you're allowed to feel whatever emotion comes up as you navigate these responses and your recovery. But please remember that we may never know why the person has done what they've done. We don't even need to know, because the only thing that we are 100% sure of is that he did do it. And he did do it regardless of what anybody else thinks and says around you. So the third myth, it wasn't really rape. It creates certain conditions and certain expectations on what rape and sexual assault actually looks like. And it essentially creates this almost like a rule book of, if your experience doesn't fit in with any of these conditions, then you weren't raped. And that can look like saying things like, well, if you haven't reported it, it hasn't happened. It can't have been that bad if you didn't go to the police. If it wasn't committed by a stranger or in a dark alleyway, it's not rape. If there are no visible injuries, are you sure? Are you sure? I think you'd be able to tell if you'd been attacked. And they may even question, well, did you run away? Did you fight them? Because if you didn't, you must have wanted it. And although on an intellectual level, we know these things aren't true, that doesn't mean that they don't impact us, that we don't internalize some of those messages. And that is true. If an individual's experience doesn't fit into this category, then they are less likely to report to the police. And they are also less likely to identify themselves as being a victim of a crime. And as we've spoken about in some of our other videos, the first step to navigating recovery is acknowledging what's happened to you. But if you don't see your experience as being rape or sexual assault because of the messages in society, then it makes it very, very difficult to acknowledge what's happened and to start to move towards healing. Which is why it's so important that we start to challenge some of these myths. So thinking about reporting, in reality, only 5 out of every 6 women who is raped reports to the police. And that decision as well should not be taken lightly. It can take somebody years to decide whether that feels right for them. And for some people, it will never feel right. And we also know that more often than not, reporting to the police doesn't actually result in the justice that a person deserves. And the existence of a rape happening does not depend on whether or not they've reported or whether or not they've even shared their experience with anybody. And there's also no evidence that rape only happens in a dark alleyway by a stranger, despite the fact that that's often depicted in TV shows, in films, and it's certainly the narrative that dominates. But in reality, 83% of women who are raped by somebody that they know. And 1 in 3, the experience takes place in their own home. So those statistics really put into perspective how rare that stranger rapes actually are. And the idea of injuries being some kind of criteria for rape is also completely untrue. Although, of course, sometimes there are physical injuries, they are not as common as you would think. I used to work in a sexual assault referral centre and I would assist with the forensic examinations. And the amount of physical injuries that we saw were so minimal. But that doesn't mean that the injuries are not there. rape is a violent act, regardless of whether or not we can see visible scars. And we know that the scars are likely more psychological, and they're also likely to affect your body in ways that we can't see. And so it's really important that we start to question the injuries we can see and the injuries that we can't see. And we definitely shouldn't be using that as a criteria for whether or not something has happened. It's also time that we stop assuming that every woman is going to fight back or run away. How she responds to that trauma has absolutely nothing to do with whether that trauma took place. The most common way that people respond to experiences like this is to freeze. They are literally unable to move or speak or fight the person off. And if you want to know more about that, then we've created a video called Why Did I?, which talks all about the different types of trauma responses and also starts to unpack some of the myths relating to each of those responses as well. So she lied is the last myth, and it's also incredibly common. And it's also incredibly common within clinical services. I've come across it, particularly when working with younger girls, this assumption that people make false allegations, whatever the motivation. I've heard attention seeking thrown about, revenge. These narratives are a part of society and they are thrown around when in reality, the actual frequency of false reporting is so low. In fact, a man is 230 times more likely to be raped himself than he is to be falsely accused. But actually, just the fact that we're putting those statistics out there, the media is partly perpetuating these myths, because when we focus on those statistics, we're not focusing on what the individuals who've experienced it themselves need. We're not focusing our resources and energy on understanding them and providing better support. We're putting our energy into talking about myths that have no place in reality. But by paying attention to these myths today, we have uncovered what they might look like, the types of messages that you may receive or you may see in society. And we have provided some of an antidote to those, some of the truths behind those myths. Because really the only way to reduce the power of these myths is to promote the truth, is to spread awareness around this topic. And although we can't completely eradicate them, part of our work at Enough is to spread awareness about them, but also to promote the fact that with awareness comes a power to be able to reject those myths, to not internalize them, and to hopefully in time to detach them from you as an individual and your experience, because they have absolutely no place in anything about yourself, how you responded to what happened, why what happened, or how you've chosen to navigate your recovery. But hopefully, as you build awareness, you will build the strength to challenge these scripts, or simply being a part of this community, being a part of Enough Together. You're bringing about a conversation, you are changing the narrative, and hopefully that's not just going to be powerful for you, but also powerful to everybody else watching and everybody else engaging in this conversation. So it would be great to hear from you on the community and continue to talk about this topic, and hopefully continue to educate people and really just debunk these myths and start spreading the truth about what sexual violence actually is and what you actually need to navigate your recovery.